The movie opens with Brian Godlock running desperately through the streets. He hears gunfire in the distance and rushes toward the sound. Two cars from rival gangs are locked in a deadly shootout. One gangster shoots the driver of the other car, making it crash. As the gangsters advance toward him, Brian quickly looks around and grabs a metal pipe. He blocks one of the cars and smashes its windshield, almost causing a crash. The gangsters then turn their guns on him. Brian was forced to run for his life. While escaping, he saw a forklift and, acting on instinct, used it to leap over the gangster's truck, decapitating one of the men. But one survivor managed to shoot him in the back. Another man, covered in rough tattoos and looking vicious, shot Brian in the throat and left him for dead. Brian was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, barely hanging on. His wife, Sai, stayed by his side, praying he would survive. The doctors succeeded in saving him, and after some time, he slowly began to recover. Not long after, Detective Vassal, who had been searching for him, came to visit. A few days later, Brian finally woke up. Saya rushed to his side with tears of joy in her eyes. He began therapy to learn how to walk again, but the attack had left him without a voice. The loss devastated him. One day, he stood in front of a mirror, crying and screaming silently at his own reflection. Saya gave him a voice box to help him speak, but his frustration grew, and he eventually turned it off. After some time, Brian was discharged from the hospital, and the story is about to take its next turn. Sia drove Brian home through a city scarred by gang violence, destruction, and decay. Everything around them looked broken and unsafe. Eventually, they reached Silence, the town where the tragedy had taken place. As they pulled up to the house, Brian thought back to happier times, remembering his son Taylor and how they once played together in the front yard. Tears welled in Brian's eyes as he looked at the empty yard. Inside the house, Taylor's toys still sat on the table. The Christmas tree remained standing, with unopened gifts beneath it. The sight overwhelmed Brian, and he broke down, unable to bear the loss of his son. Saya held him tightly as he wept in pain. Nearby, Brian noticed a news article about Taylor's murder by gang members. In a surge of anger, he tore it to pieces. Brian went into the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of vodka. He asked Saya for help, but she broke down in tears, unsure of what to do. The next morning, as Saya got ready for work, she noticed Brian hadn't slept in their bed. She found him in another room, drinking alone. Not knowing how to reach him, she sent a text asking if he had seen her keys. Brian never replied. Brian's mind was still full of memories of Taylor. He entered his son's room, which had been left exactly as it was. Sitting on the bed, he began to cry. Slowly, he lay down, as if trying to feel what it was like to have his son beside him again. Later, Brian sat in the front yard, remembering the day of the tragedy. The family had been outside while Taylor learned to ride his new bike. Suddenly, two gangsters drove by and opened fire. In the chaos, Brian and Saya realized Taylor had been shot. He died in their arms. Unable to sit idle any longer, Brian rushed to his workshop. He cleared away the empty vodka bottles and gathered his tools. Later, Saya came home. She paused in her car for a moment before going inside. Not seeing Brian, she sent him a text, but then she noticed him and realized he was ignoring her message. Brian found Detective Vassal's business card and decided to visit the station. While waiting in Vassal's office, he saw photos of local gang members on the wall. Quietly, he took pictures of them. As he looked through the images, he recognized the gangster who had shot him. His name was Pla. Before Vassal returned to his office, Brian had already left. He went home and pinned the photos of the gang members to his wall, preparing to investigate them on his own. He circled December 24th in a calendar, the day he planned to kill them all. Brian started working out and watching videos to learn how to use knives. As his training went on, the emotional distance between him and Saya grew. Yet Brian remained focused on one thing: revenge. A few months later, Brian bought a used car, excited to be one step closer to his goal. Meanwhile, Saya struggled to pay the bills. At night, she could hear him working in the garage, modifying the car, which began to wear her down. Brian also trained himself to use guns. At first, he was terrible at hitting targets, but he kept practicing. Over time, he built up a stash of weapons and started listening to the police radio for information. One night, Brian finally paused his training to spend time with Saya. She missed him, but she had already decided to move in with her mother and leave him. Frustrated, Brian vented his anger on his training dummy. Afterwards, he went for a drive, practicing his driving skills. By October, Brian began tracking the gangsters' hideouts and secretly photographing their activities. One day, he noticed that Plow was getting angry. He also saw a man leaving in a car and quickly took a photo of the license plate. By this point, Brian had transformed into a powerhouse, muscular, strong, and a skilled driver, able to control his car with precision. At the shooting range, Brian could now hit his targets quickly and accurately. The gangsters no longer stood a chance. One day, he saw a boy who looked just like Taylor. Overwhelmed with emotion, he hugged the child, but it wasn't his son. As he returned to his car, he noticed a gangster handing out money to kids nearby. Brian reached for his knife but stopped, seeing too many children around. Later, he accidentally bumped into another gangster who shoved him to the ground. Then the gangster's girlfriend poured ice cream on him, adding to his humiliation. That night, Brian steeled himself for what was coming. On December 23rd, he tracked down the home of one of the gangsters and broke in. The man heard a noise and went to investigate, but Brian knocked him out. The gangster woke up, tied to the roof of Brian's garage. Brian entered wearing a welding mask. He slashed the gangster, then handed him a pen and paper, demanding information about the gang. Brian sat down, but the gangster suddenly attacked and tried to escape. He grabbed Brian's knife and stabbed him in the leg. The two fought fiercely. In the end, Brian stabbed the gangster with a screwdriver and tackled him to the ground. The gangster continued to resist, but Brian struggled and finally overpowered him. On the 24th, Brian prepared for what was coming. He packed his gear, put on body armor, and loaded his guns. Before leaving, he wrote a note and took one last look at Taylor's room, memorizing every detail, knowing he might never return. He passed by where Saya was staying and saw her painting a picture of Taylor using art to cope with her pain. Brian then visited Taylor's grave. It was his son's birthday. He brought a gift and sat alone, crying for the first time in a long while. Eventually, he opened the gift himself. That night, Detective Vassell heard a noise and went to investigate with his gun. When he opened the door, he found a gangster tied up and gagged, along with a note. The police soon arrived to arrest the gangster. Detective Vassell opened the note and found a message from Brian. In it, Brian said he was taking care of what should have been dealt with long ago. The note also included a flash drive with detailed information about the gang and the evidence Brian had collected over the past year. Meanwhile, Brian was driving when he heard a police report about gang activity on the radio. As he passed by, he saw two gangsters beating and robbing a couple. When one of them tried to run, Brian pinned him against a wall with his car, then rammed the other before speeding off, keeping the second gangster in his sights. While inside his car, Brian struggled with a gangster and tried to push him out. When the man pulled a gun, Brian disarmed him and shot him dead. Shocked by taking his first life, Brian vomited. Later, he went to the gang's hideout and tossed a wrapped package over the wall. A gang member brought it to his boss. Inside was the severed finger of the man Brian had just killed. Elsewhere in the city, a major gang shootout erupted. Many police officers were shot and forced to take cover. Brian arrived at the scene and saw a female officer who had been injured. He drove straight into the chaos, firing at the gang members and killing as many as he could. Meanwhile, someone nearby live-streamed the entire event, including the moment the gangsters opened fire on Brian's car. Brian tried to fight off the gangster and save the injured police officer, but she was shot while trying to get into the car and died beside him. He gently pushed her body out of the car. Then he saw the man who had been live-streaming the entire event and rammed him with the car, sending him flying. Brian picked up the live streamer's phone and saw the video was still streaming. He shot the man dead so Plow would see it. Somehow, Pla realized Brian was behind the attack and immediately ordered his gang to hunt him down. Meanwhile, some gang members were fighting rivals when they saw a car approaching. It was Brian, staring straight at them. Before driving off again, Brian stopped on a bridge. He looked at an old musical toy that had belonged to Taylor and listened to its tune, reminding himself why he was doing all of this. Then he hit the road once more. But the gangsters caught up and began chasing him through the city. Brian made a sharp 180-degree turn to face the gangsters head-on. He took a risky shot and hit one of the men inside their vehicle. He drove off, but the remaining gangsters continued the chase. Soon, a man on a motorcycle joined the pursuit, shooting at Brian and forcing him to speed up. Brian ran into a roadblock and found himself trapped between two trucks, both filled with gangsters firing at him. He killed one of them, then executed a PIT maneuver on the front truck, causing both vehicles to crash into each other in a chaotic wreck. The biker continued chasing Brian, shooting at his now damaged car. He pulled up next to the window, but Brian grabbed his gun, causing the biker to lose control and crash into a wall. Brian finally stopped to catch his breath. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal sat in his car reviewing the evidence Brian had given him. Brian then headed toward the gang's headquarters, where the gangsters were gathering to discuss the recent attack on their men. Play, their leader, sent out a message calling all his men back to the building. Brian stopped just outside the gang's base and checked all his weapons to make sure they were ready. Using a phone he had stolen, Brian saw the message Play had sent to the gang. Sensing his chance, he jumped on a motorcycle and set off to finish what the gang had started. He sneaked into the hideout by following a convoy of gang vehicles. When a gunfight broke out, Brian detonated his motorcycle, causing a massive explosion that set several gang members on fire. While Brian was taking down the gang members, Pla was upstairs with the villainess, enjoying himself. Brian reached the building and heard the men screaming inside. He paused for a moment to catch his breath. Armed thugs began coming down the stairs, and Brian opened fire as they appeared. He fought fiercely, and his training was evident. None of the men could stand against his relentless attack. Switching to his sidearm, Brian continued taking down enemies one by one. At one point, he tried to reload his shotgun, but was hit 3 times in the chest. Fortunately, his body armor absorbed the shots, and he quickly got back up. He then planted an explosive trap in the main hallway. Suddenly, Brian was attacked by a gangster named Ruiz. Ruiz was much stronger and easily overpowered him, throwing him around and taking his weapon. As Brian struggled to reach his gun, he took several hard punches. Just then, a group of gangsters accidentally triggered the bomb trap, distracting Ruiz. Brian seized the chance to stab him in the shoulder, but Ruiz didn't go down. Instead, he slammed Brian with a brutal suplex. Meanwhile, Detective Vassal entered the building, walking past all the dead bodies. Exhausted, Brian and Ruiz reached for their guns. Ruiz fired first, but Brian disarmed him and shot him in the head. Vassal was attacked, but skillfully took down all the men charging at him. He found Brian, and for a moment the two pointed their guns at each other in silence. Then Vassal lowered his weapon, showing that he was on Brian's side. Suddenly, Pia opened fire on both of them. She ran for cover, reloaded quickly, and shot Brian. Then she shot Vassal in the arm. Taking advantage of the chaos, Brian crawled toward her and aimed his gun at her head, forcing her to drop her weapon. But he couldn't bring himself to shoot her. Pia then pulled out a pistol and shot Brian twice before turning the gun on Vassal. When Brian saw what happened, he shot and killed Pia. Both he and Vassal were injured and trying to recover. Later, Brian grabbed his handgun and went after Play. The two faced each other and exchanged fire. Brian took several shots to his bulletproof vest and began to weaken. Just as Play was about to strike the final blow, Vassal shot him from behind. This gave Brian the chance to tackle Play to the ground, punch him repeatedly, and strangle him to death, even as Play continued to resist until the very end. Then Brian stared into Pla's eyes as his final moments passed, imagining a happy Taylor smiling at him. Vassal crawled over to Brian, who now saw Taylor's short life flash before his eyes even imagining the future she could have had. The next scene shows Saya standing by Taylor's grave. Brian's toy is revealed to be a toy train circling the headstone. She reads a note from him and then leaves it by the grave.